extend compassion to a human, and their reaction could shatter your expectations. Part 1. The explosion came without warning. Ambassador Eth was in the middle of reading a trade document when the ship shook so hard that she fell from her hovering chair. Red lights flashed everywhere. Alarms screamed through the metal walls. Her crew ran in all directions, their clicking voices mixing into a mess of panic and fear. She was a species that looked like tall insects with shiny blue shells and many eyes. Her people had traveled the stars for thousands of years. They had seen wars and plagues and the death of worlds, but pirates attacking a diplomatic vessel. This was new. This was bad. Hull breach in Cargo Bay 7. Someone shouted through the communication system. We are losing air. Eth pushed herself up and ran toward the cargo bay. Her 4 legs moved fast, carrying her through the shaking hallways. Other crew members passed her, running the other way. They were scared. She could smell their fear in the recycled air. When she reached Cargo Bay 7, she stopped. The wall had a hole in it. Stars shone through the gap, cold and uncaring. Air rushed out with a terrible sound, pulling loose items toward the darkness of space. The emergency door controls were on the far side of the room, past the breach. To reach them, someone would have to fight against the pulling wind and the flying debris. Her navigator, a young name, stood frozen near the entrance. Her wings were pressed flat against her body. Her eyes were wide and empty. She was not moving. Eth shouted, "The controls!" Did not respond. Fear had locked her body in place. And then something moved past Eth so fast that she barely saw it. It was the human. Lieutenant was a military observer from the Sol Confederacy. He had been assigned to her ship as part of a new cultural exchange program. Eth had not paid much attention to him during the journey. Humans were a young species, only recently arrived on the galactic stage. Most older civilizations viewed them with suspicion or amusement. They were small, soft, and strangely emotional. But there was nothing small about what did next. He ran straight into the pulling wind. A piece of broken metal flew toward him, and he twisted his body to avoid it. Another piece hit his shoulder, cutting through his uniform and into his flesh. Red blood sprayed into the air, pulled toward the breach like everything else, but did not stop. He did not even slow down. He reached the emergency controls and slammed his hand onto the panel. The backup door dropped down with a heavy sound, sealing the breach. The terrible pulling stopped. The alarms continued, but the immediate danger was over. Fell to his knees. Eth moved toward him quickly. Up close, she could see the damage. A sharp piece of metal was stuck in his shoulder, and blood was flowing down his arm and dripping onto the floor. Human blood was so red. It looked almost unreal, like something from a nightmare. "Lieutenant," she said, "you are injured." He looked up at her. His face was pale and sweat covered his skin. But he smiled. He actually smiled. "Hull breach is sealed," he said. "Everyone okay?" Eth did not understand the question at first. He was the one bleeding. He was the one who had been hurt. Why was he asking about everyone else? "My crew is safe," she said slowly. "Because of you, you saved my ship." Just did what needed doing, Ambassador. Behind them was still standing in the same spot, shaking. Other crew members were starting to appear, looking at the sealed breach and the bleeding human with confusion on their faces. Nobody knew what to say. Eth made a decision. She reached into her robes and pulled out a small glass bottle. Inside was a glowing blue liquid that moved like something alive. This was the tears of first mercy, a sacred medicine passed down through her family for 12 generations. One drop could heal any wound. One bottle could bring someone back from the edge of death itself. It was meant for her children if she ever had any. It was meant for her mate if she ever found one. It was meant for the desperate moment when a life hung between existence and nothing. She had never even considered using it for an outsider. Until now. "Take this," she said, pressing the bottle into his good hand. It will heal you completely. Looked at the bottle. Then he looked at her. Something changed in his eyes, something she could not read. Ambassador, I can't take this. You must. You bled for my crew. You almost died for strangers. With respect, said, and his voice was gentle but firm, your people need this more than I do. This is obviously important. Sacred, maybe. I'll be fine. Your medical bay can patch me up. He tried to give the bottle back. Eth felt the world shift around her. In all her years of studying other species, in all her work as a diplomat and a scholar, she had never experienced anything like this moment. The mathematics of compassion were simple. You gave to those who could give back, or to those who shared your blood. You protected your own kind. That was how civilization worked. That was how survival worked. But this human, this bleeding and broken creature from a young and small species, had just thrown himself into danger for people he did not know. And now, he was refusing the most precious gift she could offer because he did not want to take something that might be needed by her people. Why, she whispered. Smile was tired but real. Because the world doesn't get better by taking things, Ambassador. It gets better by giving them. The medical team arrived and took him away, leaving Eth standing alone in the cargo bay with a bottle of sacred medicine in her hands and a crack running through everything she thought she knew about the universe. She looked at the sealed breach, at the blood on the floor, at the spot where a stranger had almost died for her crew. And she wondered, for the first time in her life, if her people had been measuring compassion all wrong. Extend compassion to a human, and their reaction could shatter your expectations. Part 2. The medical bay of the Whisper of a Chord was quiet except for the soft sounds of machines. Lieutenant lay on a table designed for bodies, which meant it was too long and too narrow for him. He did not complain. He had not complained about anything since they brought him here. Chief Physician worked on his shoulder with careful movements. Was a species that looked like lizards the size of bears. His scales were the color of old copper, and his claws were long and sharp. But those claws moved with surprising gentleness as he pulled the metal from his flesh. You should have accepted the sleep medicine, said. This will hurt. I've had worse, replied. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the edges of the table tightly. Ambassador Eth watched from the corner of the room. She still held the bottle of tears, unable to put it away. 3 hours had passed since the breach, and she still could not understand what had happened. Pulled the last piece of metal free, made a small sound of pain but did not scream. Blood flowed from the wound until applied the healing gel, which sealed the flesh together slowly. The fragment missed your main artery by a very small distance, said. If it had hit, you would have died before anyone could reach you. Good thing it missed then. You speak as if luck protected you, but you ran toward the danger. You chose to be in the path of the debris. Was quiet for a moment. I guess I did. Why? It was the same question Eth wanted to ask. She moved closer, her many eyes fixed on the human's face. In her culture, faces did not show emotion the way human faces did, but she had learned to read them a little during her studies. Right now, looked tired and thoughtful and maybe a little sad. Ambassador, said, turning his head to look at her. You asked me why. Can I answer both of you at the same time? Please, she said. Took a slow breath. The movement made him wince as his shoulder protested. Where I come from, we have a lot of history. Not all of it is good. Actually, most of it is pretty terrible. Wars, famines, plagues, cruelty on scales that would probably shock you. Humans have done awful things to each other. Eth nodded. She had studied human history before accepting the cultural exchange program. She knew about their wars. It was one of the reasons many galactic species distrusted them. But here's the thing, continued. Mixed in with all that darkness, there are these moments of light, small acts of kindness that shouldn't matter but somehow do. My grandmother used to tell me about a famine that happened in her country when she was a child. People were dying in the streets. There was no food anywhere. And one day a stranger showed up at her family's door. He was starving too, barely alive. But he had a handful of rice that he had been saving, and he shared it with them. He didn't know them. He had no reason to help them, but he did. Stopped working on the wound. Even he seemed caught by the story. My grandmother survived because of that stranger, said. She grew up, had children, and one of those children was my father. When my father was young, there was a flood. His village was destroyed and he ended up in the water, drowning. A stranger on a boat reached down and pulled him out. Again, no connection. No reason to help. Just a hand reaching into dark water to grab someone who was about to die. His voice grew softer. My father grew up, met my mother, and had me. And when I was 15, I was in a car accident. The vehicle caught fire. I was trapped inside and I was going to burn. A stranger ran into the flames and pulled me out. He didn't know my name. He just saw someone who needed help. The medical bay was completely silent now. Eth felt something strange happening inside her chest, in the place where her people believed emotions lived. I'm standing here today because of strangers, said. A whole chain of them going back generations. People who decided that a life they didn't know was still worth saving. People who gave when they had nothing. People who risked everything for someone they would never see again. He looked at Eth directly. How could I be the kind of person who breaks that chain? How could I watch your navigator freeze and your crew die and do nothing, when everything I am exists because other people refuse to do nothing? Eth felt the bottle in her hands. 12 generations of compassion, measured and saved and protected, used only for those who shared blood and name. Her people called it wisdom. They called it the proper way of things. But was describing something different. Something that did not count or measure or calculate. Something that simply gave, over and over, without asking for anything back. You refuse the tears, she said slowly, because you believe someone else might need them more. There are children somewhere who might get sick, said. There are people in your family who might get hurt. That medicine has been passed down for generations and it should keep going. I'll heal the slow way. It'll hurt and it'll leave a scar, but I'll be fine. Your people's history doesn't need to end because of me. Made a sound that might have been surprise. You think of our future more than your own comfort. Smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. That's kind of the whole point, Doc. The future is bigger than any one person, and it gets built one small act of kindness at a time. Eth looked down at the tears of First Mercy. She had always thought of them as her family's treasure, something precious that belonged to her bloodline. But standing here, listening to this young human describe a chain of strangers who had saved each other across generations, she began to see them differently. Maybe compassion was not meant to be hoarded. Maybe it was meant to be shared. Maybe her people had forgotten that somewhere along the way. She carefully placed the bottle back in her robes, but something had changed. She knew that she would never look at it the same way again. And she knew that she would never look at humans the same way either. Extend compassion to a human, and their reaction could shatter your expectations. Part 3. News travels fast on a ship, even when nobody means to spread it. Within 2 days, every member of the crew knew what the human had done. They whispered about it in the meal halls. They discussed it during their work shifts. They argued about it in their sleeping quarters when the lights went dim. A human had saved the ship. A human had refused sacred medicine. A human had spoken of strangers saving strangers across generations, as if this was normal, as if this was how things should be. Navigator could not stop thinking about it. She was young, barely old enough to serve on a diplomatic vessel. This was her first real assignment, and she had failed in the worst possible way. When the breach happened, when the air started rushing out and death came calling, she had frozen. Her body had locked in place like a machine with no power. She had stood there, useless and afraid, while a creature from another species threw himself into danger. The shame was eating her from the inside. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the breach. She saw the human running past her. She saw his blood mixing with the escaping air. And she saw herself standing still, doing nothing. On the third night, she gave up trying to rest and walked to the observation deck. The observation deck was a large room at the front of the ship with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Stars filled the view, endless and ancient, burning with light that had traveled millions of years to reach this moment. It was the kind of view that was supposed to make problems feel small. It was not working. Was about to turn around and leave when she saw that she was not alone. Was sitting on a bench near the windows, his injured arm wrapped in a support device. He was looking out at the stars with an expression she could not read. He seemed peaceful but also sad, maybe tired. She did not know how to interpret human faces very well. She considered leaving quietly, but something made her stay. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice small in the large room. He turned his head. "Navigator right, come sit down, the view is nice." She walked slowly toward him, her wings pressed tight against her body. Standing near him felt strange. He was so different from her people. He had soft skin instead of a shell. He had only two eyes. He moved in ways that seemed wrong, all straight lines and sudden stops. But he had saved her life. That counted for something. She sat on the bench, leaving space between them. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saving the ship, for saving me. I should have been the one to close the breach. It was my station, but I could not move." Was quiet for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "First time in a real emergency." "Yes. It happens." His voice was gentle, not angry. "Everyone freezes sometimes. The body does strange things when it thinks it's going to die. Your brain shuts down the parts that make decisions. Your muscles lock up. It's not your fault." Santeni drooped. "But you did not freeze. You ran toward the danger." "I've been in emergencies before, many of them. The first time I froze too. I was 17 and there was a fire in my training facility. I just stood there while everyone else ran. A friend had to drag me out." Looked at him. Truly. Truly, I was useless. I was so ashamed that I almost quit the military program. I thought I was a coward who would never be good enough. "What changed?" Smiled. It was a small smile touched with old memories. "An older soldier talked to me. She said something I never forgot. She said that courage is not about never being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and moving anyway. Fear is normal. Fear is healthy. It tells you that something is dangerous, but you can learn to move even when you're scared. It just takes time and practice." Considered this. In her culture, fear was seen as weakness. Her teachers had always said that a good should not feel fear at all, but was describing something different. He was saying that fear was part of the process, not the end of it. "How do you practice?" she asked. "You put yourself in small, difficult situations on purpose. You train in simulated emergencies until your body learns that it can move even when it's afraid. And you forgive yourself when you fail because failure is part of learning." Looked at her. "You froze this time. Next time you'll move. I can tell." "How can you tell?" "Because you're sitting here asking questions instead of hiding in your quarters. You're facing the problem instead of running from it. That takes strength." Felt something warm spread through her chest. It was an unfamiliar feeling, something between gratitude and hope. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Why are humans like this? Your species is so young. You barely have a presence in this part of space. Most of the older civilizations do not trust you. They say you are violent and unpredictable. But you threw yourself into danger for strangers and now you are sitting here, helping me feel better about failing. I do not understand." Was quiet for a long moment. The stars wheeled slowly past the windows as the ship continued its journey through the void. "We're the new kids," he finally said. "We know what it's like to be small and scared and alone in the dark. For most of our history, we had nobody to help us. We had to help each other or we died. And even when we fought each other, even when we did terrible things, there were always people who believed that kindness was worth choosing. They passed that belief down, generation after generation, until it became part of who we are. He turned to look at her directly. Maybe that's why we reach out so quickly. We remember what it feels like to have nobody reaching back, and we've decided that nobody else should have to feel that way if we can help it. Did not know what to say, so she simply sat beside him, looking at the stars, and let the silence fill the space between them. After a while, she realized that the shame in her chest had become smaller. It had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a crushing weight. It was more like a lesson waiting to be learned. And for the first time since the breach, she thought that maybe she would be okay. Extend compassion to a human, and their reaction could shatter your expectations. Part 4. The High Council met in a great hall that floated among the clouds of their home world. The building was ancient, older than most species in the galaxy. Its walls were made of crystal that sang when the wind blew through it. Its floors were carved from stone that had seen the rise and fall of empires. Ambassador Eth stood in the center of this hall, facing the 12 elders who ruled her people. They sat on high platforms, looking down at her with their many eyes. Their shells were dark with age, covered in the patterns that told the story of their families going back 1,000 generations. She had never felt so small. "You have called this emergency meeting," Elder said. His voice echoed through the crystal walls. "You claim to have important news about the humans. Speak." Eth took a deep breath. She had prepared for this moment during the entire journey home. She had practiced her words, organized her arguments, prepared for every question. But now that she was here, she felt afraid in a way she had not expected. "Honored elders," she began, "during my diplomatic mission, my ship was attacked by pirates. We suffered a hull breach that should have killed my crew, but a human observer saved us. He ran into the breach, sealed the emergency door, and was badly injured in the process." The elders exchanged glances. Elder, the oldest among them, made a clicking sound of surprise. "A human saved lives. This is unusual." "It becomes more unusual," Eth continued. "After the human was injured, I offered him the tears of first mercy from my family line. It would have healed him completely. He refused." The hall went completely silent. "Refused?" Elder leaned forward. "The tears are the most precious medicine in our culture. No one has ever refused them. He said that my people might need them more. He said that sacred things should be preserved for those they were meant for. He chose to heal slowly and painfully rather than take something precious from us." The elders were stunned. Eth could see the confusion on their old faces. They had lived for centuries. They had seen many things, but they had never heard of anything like this. "This makes no sense," Elder said. She was the youngest of the elders, only 400 years old. What did the human want in return? What was his strategy? He wanted nothing. There was no strategy. He simply believed that helping strangers was the right thing to do. "Impossible," Elder replied. "All species act in their own interest. Even kindness is a form of exchange. We help others so they will help us later. This is the mathematics of survival." Eth felt something rising in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced in the medical bay when told his stories about strangers saving strangers. It was a mix of sadness and hope and something that might have been shame. "I thought the same thing," she said. "I have studied compassion for my entire career. I have written papers on the calculations of kindness. I believed that I understood how it worked." She paused. "I was wrong." "Explain," Elder commanded. The human told me about his family history. His grandmother survived a famine because a stranger shared food with her. His father survived a flood because a stranger pulled him from the water. The human himself survived an accident because a stranger rescued him from fire. 3 generations of his family exist because strangers chose to help without expecting anything back. She looked at each elder in turn. He said that he could not break the chain. He said that the world gets better one small act of kindness at a time. And then he handed back the most precious thing I could offer him because he believed someone else might need it more. The hall was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of minds working, of old ideas being questioned. Elder spoke slowly. You are suggesting that humans have a different understanding of compassion than we do. I am suggesting that humans remember something we have forgotten. We measure our kindness. We save it for our own blood. We calculate the benefits before we act. But humans give freely without counting, without expecting return. And somehow their species has survived and grown despite this. Perhaps because of this. This is dangerous thinking, Elder said. If we gave our resources to every stranger in need, we would have nothing left for ourselves. This is basic mathematics. Is it? Ed asked. The human's grandmother received a handful of rice from a stranger. Because of that gift, she lived to raise a family. Her son grew up and had children of his own. Her grandson became a soldier who saved a ship full of lives. One small act of kindness, given without calculation, rippled across generations and touched people the original giver never knew existed. She gestured toward the windows, toward the stars visible through the crystal walls. We call ourselves wise because we protect what is ours. But what if we have been protecting too well? What if by hoarding our compassion, we have made ourselves smaller instead of safer? The elders argued for 7 hours. Some agreed with Ev. Others thought she had been manipulated by a clever human scheme. Others simply could not understand how any species could function without the mathematics of measured kindness. But in the end, Elder called for a vote. The question before us, he said, is whether to open formal alliance negotiations with the Sol Confederacy. Those in favor. 7 hands rose. Those against. 5 hands rose. It was close, but it was enough. The motion passes, Elder announced. We will reach out to the humans. We will begin building a relationship with this strange young species. He paused and looked at Ev. And we will send them a gift, something that shows we understand what they have taught us. What gift? Ev asked. A grove of 1,000-year trees, Elder said. They are the symbol of our people's patience and wisdom. We have never given them to outsiders before, but perhaps it is time to start a new tradition. Ev felt tears forming in her eyes. Among her people, tears were rare and precious, only shed in moments of deep emotion. Why this gift? She asked. Elder smiled, an expression that looked strange on his ancient face. Because trees grow slowly, one ring at a time, building something greater than any single season, just like the chain of kindness your human described. He looked toward the stars. Perhaps it is time we added our own rings to that chain. And in that moment, Ev knew that something had changed in the galaxy, something that could never be unchanged. A stranger had reached out, and her people had finally reached back. Extend compassion to a human, and their reaction could shatter your expectations. Part 5. 20 years had passed since the day ran into a hull breach to save a ship full of strangers. The galaxy had changed in those 20 years. The alliance between the Sol Confederacy and the Collective had grown from a simple agreement into something much larger. Other species had joined. Trade routes had opened. Walls that had stood for centuries began to crumble, and at the center of it all, on the red surface of Mars, stood something remarkable. The 1,000-year trees had taken root. Nobody had expected them to survive. Mars was cold and dry, with thin air and dangerous radiation. They had sent their most sacred trees as a gift, but many believed the gesture was symbolic. The trees would die, people said, because some things simply cannot grow in foreign soil. But the humans refused to accept that. They built special domes to protect the trees. They adjusted the soil and the water and the light until conditions were just right. They worked for years, failing and trying again, refusing to let the gift die. And slowly, impossibly, the trees began to grow. Now there was an entire grove of them. Their trunks were thick and strong, their branches reaching toward the dome ceiling. Their leaves glowed with soft blue light, a color that did not exist anywhere else on Mars. At night, the grove looked like a piece of the home world transplanted across the stars. People came from everywhere to see it, and humans walked among the trees together, speaking in languages that mixed and blended until they became something new. Children of both species played in the roots, laughing in sounds that their grandparents would not have recognized. Stood at the edge of the grove, watching the lights dance on the trees. He was older now. His hair had gone gray at the temples and lines marked his face. His shoulders still ached when the weather changed, a permanent reminder of the day everything started. He had left the military years ago, but he still carried himself like a soldier. Some things never fully fade. "Admiral." He turned. A woman approached him, her shell decorated with the patterns of a diplomatic family. She was old but moved with grace and purpose. Her many eyes reflected the blue light of the trees. "Ambassador Eth," he said, smiling, "it's just now I retired." "You will always be the man who ran into the breach," she replied. "Titles cannot change that." They stood together looking at the grove. 20 years had changed them both. Eth's shell had darkened with age and her movements were slower than before, but her eyes were still sharp, still curious, still searching for understanding. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For what?" "For shattering my understanding of the universe." She made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I spent my whole life studying compassion like a science. I measured it, calculated it, tried to understand its mathematics. And then you handed back the tears and told me stories about strangers saving strangers, and everything I knew became uncertain." Shook his head. "I just did what I was taught to do, nothing special about it." "That is exactly what makes it special." Eth turned to face him directly. "You did not think of your actions as extraordinary. You saw danger and you moved. You were offered a treasure and you gave it back. For you, this was simply how things should be. That is the most revolutionary idea I have ever encountered." Before could respond, a small figure approached them. A child, her shell still soft with youth, walked through the grove with careful steps. Behind her came a young human boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old. They were holding hands, their differences made small by their friendship. "Grandmother," the child said, looking at Eth, "you said you would introduce me to the hero from the stories." Eth's eyes softened. "This is my granddaughter, named after the navigator you saved all those years ago. The original became one of our best pilots," said. "I heard she runs a training program now, teaching young navigators how to stay calm in emergencies." "She teaches them about the chain," Young said. "She tells them that courage is being afraid and moving anyway." Felt something warm in his chest. The words he had spoken in an observation deck 20 years ago had traveled further than he could have imagined. They had been passed down, repeated, transformed into lessons for a new generation. "What chain?" the human boy asked. He looked at with wide, curious eyes. Knelt down so he was at eye level with both children. 20 years of diplomacy, of speeches, of formal negotiations, and it all came back to this. A question from children who wanted to understand. "A long time ago," he said, "there was a famine. People were starving, and a stranger shared his last bit of food with a family he didn't know. That family survived, and one of them grew up and pulled a drowning man from the water. The man who was saved grew up and had a son, and that son was pulled from a fire by another stranger." The children listened, their eyes wide. Each person in the chain was saved by someone who didn't know them, and each person who was saved went on to help others, passing the kindness forward. The chain keeps growing, link by link, connecting people across time and space. Are we part of the chain? Young asked. Everyone is part of the chain, said. Every time you help someone without expecting anything back, you add a new link. Every time you choose kindness over selfishness, the chain grows stronger. It started before any of us were born, and it will keep going long after we're gone. The human boy looked at his friend, then back at. So if I help with something, I'm making the chain longer. That's exactly right. Young squeezed her friend's hand. Then we'll make it very long together. The two children ran off into the grove, their laughter echoing among the glowing trees. Watched them go, feeling something he could not quite name. It was bigger than happiness, deeper than satisfaction. It was the feeling of watching the future unfold in the direction he had hoped for. Eth stood beside him, silent for a long moment. 20 years ago, she finally said, you told me that the world gets better one small act of kindness at a time. I did not fully understand what you meant. But now, watching our play together under trees that should not exist on this world, I think I finally do. Looked at the grove, at the blue light dancing on the red soil, at the children vanishing among the ancient trunks. The chain keeps growing, he said. That's all that matters. Somewhere in the stars above, ships from a dozen species traveled routes that had not existed a generation ago. Somewhere in the halls of power, leaders made decisions based on trust that had once seemed impossible. And somewhere in the hearts of strangers across the galaxy, small acts of kindness were adding links to a chain that had no end. It had started with a handful of rice during a famine. It had continued with a hand reaching into dark water. It had grown with a stranger running into flames. And now it stretched across the stars, connecting species and worlds in ways that no one could have predicted. The chain was still growing, and smiled, knowing that it would never stop.